Africa's inequality crisis is deepening at an alarming rate, and that's according to a new report by Oxfam. And that's just four of the continent's richest billionaires now hold more wealth than half of Africa's population. That's 750 million people. Now, the report, launched ahead of the Africa Union mid-year coordination meeting in Malabo, highlights how rising inequality is being fueled by unfair tax systems, declining social spending, and policies that favor the ultra-rich, whilst millions face hunger, unemployment, and worsening public services. Africa's richest continue to see their fortunes grow, and sadly, the poor among us, well, they just get poorer and poorer. You'll hear stories, sadly, even of our heads of state, sometimes being part of this bandwagon. I'm not going to mention the country, but there is one country on the west coast, southern west coast of Africa, where the president spent on one yacht, a boat, more than his country's education budget. And that gives you the sense of just how much, and this country is oil rich, and yet this people's citizens are amongst the poorest in the world. And so whilst we often point fingers at the business people, the billionaires, vis-a-vis the population, sometimes, unfortunately, even our leaders across the continent are part of this pervasive problem. But anyway, to help us unpack the findings of this report titled Africa's Inequality Crisis and the Rise of the Super Rich, we're now joined by Kwesi Obeng, who's an accountable governance lead at Oxfam in Africa. Thank you for joining us on the program, Kwesi. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Peter.
All right, so let's begin with this headline figure that's been making waves. 4 billionaires, 4 people, hold more wealth than half of Africa's population. What does this figure really tell us about the state of inequality on the continent today?
Well, so thank you very much. For some time now, we've been tracking the scale and the scope of inequality across the world. And each time we also focus on the situation in Africa. And the particular situation of Africa is increasingly unique for many reasons. One is that not only is inequality increasingly becoming extreme, but it's actually accelerating. So the spread and the depth of it continues to expand across the world. Africa is second to only Latin America as the most unequal parts of the world. And as we speak at the moment, more than half of the 50 most unequal countries are on the continent. And you're right, from our data, 4 of the richest men essentially have more wealth than half of the continent's population. And the continent's population is said to be about 1.4 billion. So that's about 700 plus people. Just 4 men. Remember, there's no woman. And so that's really the scale. And it's not just that. In fact, African dollar millionaires account for just 0.02% of the entire population, and yet own nearly a fifth of the region's wealth, whilst the bottom 50% essentially own less than 1%. And as I said, we've seen a particular deterioration over the last 5 years, post the COVID era in particular. So 2 things. One is that African billionaires have increased their wealth, by more than 50%. In fact, 56% over the past 5 years alone. That's from 2020. And again, since 2020, the average income of the richest 1% has increased 2.5 times more or faster than the bottom 50%. So you would see a trend in terms of the acceleration towards deeper inequality. And mind you, that the fact is this: inequality is bad not only for the poor, but it's also bad for the rich and for broader society. In fact, and from the empirical data, unequal societies are more secure and safe. In fact, it even hurts not just simply poverty, but actually growth. The growth that we need to be able to create more opportunities, more jobs for particularly the growing numbers of young people on the continent. So that gives you a sense of the scale and why we think it's important for our governments to work together to address this crisis, particularly also the fact that from the UN, no African country is able to meet the 17 SDG goals. We're only 5 years away from Agenda 2030.
So what are the main drivers of this inequality? Why are people getting left behind and the rich seem to be getting richer?
Well, so again, a couple of things. One of them is that we have seen that some of the progressive policies that our governments introduced, particularly at the height of the COVID, have been withdrawn. And that in itself is troubling because our government recognized in the midst of COVID that we needed some safety nets to protect the most vulnerable in our society. And soon after the COVID, a lot of pressure was brought to bear on our governments, including and particularly from the IMF, for them to slash public spending. And so governments have withdrawn from some of those progressive policies. And the impact has been a withdrawal of some of the critical services like education, healthcare, and social protection, and workers' rights that ordinary citizens depend on. So that's one of the key drivers, the withdrawal. And then also, in terms of policy, indeed, from our commitment to reducing inequality index, Africa's tax policy, compared to any other region in the world, is the least able to address inequality and promote redistribution. That is very important in fixing inequality. And then also the fact that you have an international financial architecture that simply allows and encourages the hemorrhaging of wealth from the region elsewhere to avoid paying a fair share of their taxes. And the last thing is the fact that most of our countries essentially hardly tax wealth and income of the rich. There are a few numbers that I can share with you, but I'll let you carry on.
All right, Kwesi. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, and I think this is a conversation we probably need to have again quite soon because it is so important. But thanks so much indeed for giving us the highlights of this report. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's Kwesi Obeng, Accountable Governance Lead for Oxfam in Africa, talking about the disparity in wealth and income across the continent. Very sad.